Well, for an in-depth look at education trends in China and globally, let's bring in Rob Filback. He's a professor of clinical education and the chair of the Master of Arts in Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages at the USC Rossier School of Education. Thank you for being with us.
Pleasure.
So let's talk funding. Just how much has education funding changed in the past 5 to 10 years?
A lot has changed. It's actually the end of a trend that's been going on for 30 years, where you had costs when I went to college back in the 80s that could largely be covered through grants and scholarships. That's changed dramatically. You've had tuition rises in the area of 500% since that time. And now you've had scholarships and grants mainly staying flat. So what's happening is approximately 40% of the tuition burden, tuition fees, living, are falling on students and families. This is a big increase, and it's actually increased dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years, mainly due through the Great Recession here in the U.S. As a result of that, a lot of state funding was cut. The federal funding has tried to make it up, but it just hasn't been able to. So we've really seen a dramatic increase in the debt burden as a result of the last few years of economic woes in the U.S.
And speaking of that debt burden, we know that just in the US, there's $1.3 trillion of debt owed by some 44 million students. So that's second only to mortgage debt as the highest consumer debt category. So how does that compare with the situation globally?
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right about what's happening in the U.S. It's dramatic, and we're nearing a crisis. Of that debt you just mentioned, about 7 million of those borrowers are actually in default. So the U.S. is not a pretty picture in this area, and a lot of families are already or will be in crisis. The picture's a little more mixed globally. You have some countries, take Germany, where higher education is virtually 100% subsidized by the government. Students can leave higher ed basically debt-free. You have other countries like Sweden, where ostensibly you have a system that is highly subsidized by the government, and yet increasingly we're seeing students there taking loans out just to cover living. And then you have other places like the UK, where you actually have an increasing number of students that are getting into debt due to higher education costs, and a larger number of those getting into crisis. So I think what we can say is that the U.S. has unfortunately set the bar in this area, and it's not good. Right. But what we're going to be seeing in the next few decades, I believe, is increasing challenges around the world in this area as well.
And as we look around the world, let's also look at China. What are some of the changes that you've seen there over the last decade?
Well, some of the most interesting changes have to do with some of the pressures on the demand side of education. And so if we just take higher education in China, for example, one of the areas that we're seeing is really an increasing appetite for skills in the area of critical thinking, creativity skills, skills associated with innovation and new types of teaching models and outcomes. And so as a result of that, you're seeing a lot of families choosing to opt out of the traditional system in China. We're seeing a larger influx of students from China into the U.S. And so this appetite for the skills that we typically associate with a traditional liberal arts education is growing. Another area that we're seeing a big change has to do with an increasing number of stakeholders, students, families, employers, really asking what is going to be taught to students in higher ed. What kind of skills and competencies are they going to receive? And so this is having another set of effects on the curriculum and what faculty are doing in the classroom.
And Rob, that's an interesting point that you raised, because given the trends that we're seeing in the sorts of jobs of the future in this robot revolution, how are schools adapting or changing their curriculum to really prepare students better for that?
Well, so it's mixed. You have great examples. Of course, countries like China and the US are very stratified. So you have wonderful examples here and there, and then you have a much different picture in other parts of the country and other different parts of the various regions. But I think we're also, when it comes to technology and integrating digital literacy and multimedia literacy into education, we're sort of in an in-between right now. You have faculty like me who largely grew up without technology, teaching students who are so-called digital natives who don't know what it was like to grow up without technology. And so I would say that there are some great examples around the world of integrating technology in meaningful ways. But I would say, again, in the next decade or two, you're going to see dramatic changes as the pressure by the students themselves is going to have a big effect on what colleges and universities have to do in the classroom.
All right, well, thank you so much, Professor Rob Filback from USC Rossier School of Education.